Step out of the vehicle. Slowly. The words cut through the quiet like a siren before the siren, sharp and practiced, carrying the weight of authority that didn't ask twice. Red and blue lights pulsed across the empty stretch of road, washing over the asphalt, the trees, the side mirror of a modest silver sedan parked neatly against the curb. Inside, Evelyn Carter sat with both hands resting gently on the steering wheel, fingers slightly curled, not from fear but from age, from years lived and carried with quiet dignity. The glow from the patrol car painted her face in shifting colors, red then blue, then red again, catching the soft lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her hair, the calm that refused to break. She had been driving under the speed limit, 10 miles per hour below, the radio low, a hymn barely audible beneath the hum of the engine. The night air outside was cool for early fall, somewhere in the low 60s, and the scent of distant pine drifted faintly through the half-inch crack in her window. She turned her head slightly as the officer approached, the beam of a flashlight sliding across her dashboard, her hands, her face, lingering just a second longer than necessary. Officer Daniel Brooks stopped beside the driver's window, posture rigid, one hand resting near his belt, the other holding the light steady. He didn't greet her. Didn't soften his tone. "License and registration," he said, each word clipped, efficient, as if the moment had already been judged before it began. Evelyn blinked once, slowly, then nodded, her movements deliberate, measured. "Of course, officer," she replied, her voice low, steady, carrying a warmth that didn't match the coldness pressing in from outside. She reached carefully toward her purse, the leather worn smooth from years of use, the zipper opening with a soft, familiar sound. The light followed her hand. Watched. Waited. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed, its tires whispering against the road, then fading into nothing. The world seemed to narrow to this one moment, this one exchange, suspended between breath and consequence. Brooks glanced at her again, really looked this time, or thought he did, and something in his expression hardened, a subtle shift, almost invisible, but present. In his mind, the scene had already arranged itself into something familiar, something easy to categorize, to control. An elderly black woman. Driving. At night. Out of place. He leaned slightly closer, the beam of his flashlight catching the reflection in her eyes. "Where are you coming from tonight?" he asked, the question sounding less like curiosity and more like a test. Evelyn paused, just for a heartbeat, her fingers resting on the edge of her wallet before she answered. Outside, the lights continued their silent rhythm, red to blue, blue to red, painting the road in alternating truths. She lifted her gaze to meet his, not challenging, not submissive, just present. And in that stillness, something unspoken settled into the air, heavier than the night itself. "I am coming from St. Matthew's," Evelyn said softly, her voice steady, almost gentle, as if the night itself deserved respect. The words settled into the space between them, but they did not seem to land. Officer Brooks did not nod. He did not acknowledge. The beam of his flashlight shifted slightly, tracing the curve of her steering wheel, the worn fabric of her sleeve, the small cross pendant resting against her chest. St. Matthew's. The name lingered, but to him it was just another answer, another line in a routine he had performed hundreds of times. "Doing what?" he asked, his tone unchanged, flat, procedural, but edged with something quieter, something less visible. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly on her wallet now, her driver's license halfway out, the plastic catching a flicker of blue light. She did not rush. She never rushed. "They held a memorial tonight," she said, her eyes lowering briefly, not in submission but in memory. "For my husband." The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation. For a moment, the hum of the patrol car behind them seemed louder, the engine idling like a distant heartbeat. Brooks shifted his stance, just slightly, his boots pressing against the pavement, gravel crunching under the movement. "Stay in the car," he said, even though she had not moved. The command came out automatically, rehearsed, detached from the reality in front of him. Evelyn paused, her hand still, then slowly placed the license on the dashboard instead of handing it directly to him, a small gesture of compliance shaped by experience. The plastic rectangle lay there under the shifting lights, red, then blue, then red again, her name faintly visible but not yet read. Inside the car, the air felt still, almost too still, as if time had thinned. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, leaves whispering against one another in a quiet rhythm. Evelyn drew in a slow breath, her chest rising gently, the scent of old leather and faint lavender surrounding her. She had worn that perfume for years, just a trace, something her husband used to notice without saying a word. Her gaze lifted again, steady, meeting the outline of the man beside her window, not challenging him, not retreating either. Just present. Brooks leaned in slightly, the beam of his flashlight now resting on the license, but he did not pick it up. Not yet. His eyes moved over her again, assessing, measuring, placing her somewhere within a narrative he had already constructed. The question hung unspoken, heavier than the ones he had already asked. Why are you here? Why are you driving alone? Why this road? Why now? Evelyn felt it without needing to hear it. She had felt it before, in different voices, in different years, under different lights. The silence stretched, thin and deliberate. Then, quietly, almost like a breath carried on the night air, she spoke again. Is there a reason I was stopped, officer? The question was calm, respectful, but it did not disappear. It stayed there, between them, waiting. The lights continued their steady pulse, painting the scene in alternating color, as if the truth itself had not decided which side it belonged to. Brooks did not answer her question right away, and that silence said more than anything he could have said out loud, his jaw tightening just slightly as if the words she had spoken had not been expected, as if they had disrupted a script he preferred to follow without interruption, and when he finally spoke his voice came out lower, firmer, carrying the weight of authority that did not feel the need to explain itself. You were driving 10 miles under the speed limit, he said, his flashlight now fixed on the license resting on the dashboard but still untouched. That can indicate impairment or suspicious behavior. The phrase sounded practiced, pulled from training rather than thought, and it hung there between them, clinical and distant, as if it belonged more to a report than to this quiet road. Evelyn listened without reacting, her hands still resting where they had been, open and visible, her posture straight but not rigid, and for a moment the only movement came from the flicker of red and blue lights sliding across the inside of her car, reflecting faintly off the windshield and the polished surface of the dashboard. She had heard explanations like this before, different words, same meaning, different officers, same tone, and something in her expression softened, not in defeat but in recognition. As if she understood the pattern even before it fully unfolded. I see, she said. Gently, her voice calm enough to steady the air itself, and she did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not challenge him in a way that would escalate the moment, but there was something in the way she held herself, something quiet and unshaken, that did not yield either. Brooks shifted again, his boots pressing into the pavement, the faint crunch of gravel marking his impatience. He leaned in closer now, finally reaching toward the dashboard, his fingers hovering for a brief second before picking up the license, the plastic cool under his touch, and as he lifted it the light caught the printed name, the letters clear and steady, Evelyn Carter. He read it once, then again, something in his eyes narrowing not because he recognized it but because he did not, because it did not fit into the assumption he had already formed. He flipped the card slightly, checking the address, the date of birth, 72 years old. His gaze flicked back up to her face, comparing the number to the person sitting in front of him, and for a moment there was a pause, small but noticeable, the kind that comes when expectation and reality do not quite align. Where are you headed now, Ms. Carter? He asked, the use of her name sounding formal but not respectful, more like a label than an acknowledgement. Evelyn took a slow breath, the kind that fills the lungs completely before leaving just as quietly, and her eyes moved briefly past him, toward the stretch of road ahead, dark and open, as if measuring the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. Home, she said simply, and there was something in that word, something grounded, something final, that did not invite further complication, But the moment did not release her, the lights continued to pulse. The night remained suspended, and Brooks held the license in his hand a second longer than necessary, as if searching for something he could not quite name, while somewhere behind them the distant hum of another engine began to grow, faint at first, then slowly louder, approaching the scene without yet revealing what it would bring. The distant engine grew louder, not fast, not urgent, but steady, like something approaching with purpose rather than haste, and Brooks turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge it, the red and blue lights from his cruiser now blending with the soft white glow of headlights emerging from down the road, another vehicle slowing as it neared the scene, its tires easing against the asphalt. And for a brief moment the world seemed to widen again, no longer just the two of them suspended in silence but part of something larger, something being watched. Evelyn noticed it too, her eyes shifting just slightly toward the approaching light before returning to the officer, her expression unchanged, calm, present, as if she had already decided that whatever came next would not change who she was in this moment. Brooks straightened a little, his grip on her license tightening just enough to show that his focus had shifted. Not away from her but outward, aware now of visibility, of presence, of eyes that might interpret what they saw without context or control. The other car slowed further, then stopped several yards behind the patrol unit, its headlights dimming slightly but not turning off, casting a long shadow across the road that stretched toward Evelyn's car like a silent witness. Brooks exhaled through his nose, a small, controlled release of tension, then stepped back half a pace from the driver's window, creating space where there had been none, but the air did not lighten, it only changed shape. "Sit tight," he said, his voice still firm but no longer as sharp, as if something in the moment had adjusted his tone without his permission. Evelyn gave a slight nod, not because she had been told to, but because she understood the rhythm of situations like this, understood how they unfolded when pressure met presence. Her hands remained where they were, resting gently, open, visible, a quiet statement that did not need to be spoken. Brooks turned his body slightly toward the rear of the scene, glancing once more at the vehicle behind him, then back at her, as if measuring whether to continue or to pause, and in that hesitation something subtle surfaced, not doubt exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when certainty begins to thin. He looked down again at the license in his hand, this time holding it longer, his eyes tracing the details more carefully, the address, the date, the name, Evelyn Carter. The letters no longer just information but something that seemed to resist being reduced to a category. He glanced up again, meeting her eyes for a fraction of a second, and this time the look lingered just a bit longer, not confrontational, not softened either, just searching, as if trying to reconcile what he saw with what he expected to see. "You said you were at a memorial," he added, the question forming after the fact, quieter than before, less like an accusation and more like a thread he was unsure how to follow. Evelyn nodded once, her gaze steady. "Yes, officer," she said, and there was something in the way she spoke, something grounded and unhurried, that made the night feel less like a confrontation and more like a moment waiting to reveal itself. The lights continued their steady pulse, red to blue, blue to red, but now they seemed less dominant, less controlling, as if the scene was no longer defined only by authority but by something quieter, something human, and behind them the second vehicle remained still. Its presence unspoken but undeniable, a reminder that this moment was no longer contained, that it existed now in more than one pair of eyes, and Brooks stood there, license in hand, caught between procedure and something he had not yet named. The night did not move, but something inside it tightened, like a breath held too long, and Brooks felt it before he could explain it, a subtle pressure building beneath the surface of what should have been routine. His fingers still wrapped around the license as if it anchored him to the moment, but the longer he stood there the less certain that anchor felt. The second vehicle behind him remained quiet, its engine idling low, headlights steady. Not approaching, not leaving, just present, and that presence began to press against the edges of his authority in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with being seen. He shifted his weight again, the gravel under his boots marking the movement, and his eyes returned to Evelyn, really returned this time, not just scanning, not just categorizing, but observing, and what he saw did not match the narrative he had already written in his mind. She was not nervous, not defensive, not trying to explain herself beyond what was asked. She simply existed there with a kind of stillness that did not bend under scrutiny, and that unsettled him more than resistance ever could. "Step out of the vehicle," he said finally, the words coming out slower now, less automatic, as if he had to choose them rather than rely on them. The command hung in the air, heavier than before, and for a moment nothing moved. Evelyn did not react immediately, not out of defiance but out of deliberation. Her eyes lowered briefly to the steering wheel, then lifted again, meeting his gaze with the same calm presence she had held since the beginning. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "Is there a reason you need me to step out, officer?" The question was not sharp, not confrontational, but it did not disappear either. It stayed between them, steady, asking to be acknowledged. Brooks exhaled, a small sound, almost lost beneath the hum of the engines around them. He glanced again toward the second vehicle, then back at her, and something in his posture shifted, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt. "Just procedure," he said, though the words sounded thinner. Now, less certain than they had before, Evelyn held his gaze for a brief moment longer, then nodded once, slowly, her hands moving with care as she reached for the door handle, the motion unhurried, intentional, every movement visible, every gesture controlled. The door opened with a soft click, the interior light flickering on and casting a warm glow that contrasted against the cold flashes of red and blue outside. She stepped out carefully, her shoes meeting the pavement with a quiet, steady sound, and for a second the scene shifted, no longer contained within the car but exposed to the open air, the cool breeze brushing against her face, lifting a few strands of silver hair. She stood upright beside the vehicle, not shrinking, not expanding, simply present, and Brooks took a half step back to give space, though. The distance did not ease the tension, it only made it more visible. The lights continued their rhythm, but now they fell across both of them equally, painting no one as more or less than the other, and somewhere behind them a car door from the second vehicle opened softly, not loud, not intrusive, but enough to signal that the moment had shifted again, that it was no longer just between two people on a quiet road, but something unfolding under quiet observation. And Brooks stood there, license still in his hand, facing a woman who had not raised her voice, had not resisted, had not done anything except remain exactly who she was, and for the first time that seemed to complicate everything. The door from the second vehicle closed with a soft, measured sound, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, and the footsteps that followed were steady against the pavement, each one clear in the quiet night air, not loud enough to interrupt, but impossible to ignore. Evelyn heard them before she turned, her body still facing forward, her posture unchanged, shoulders relaxed, hands resting loosely at her sides, the cool air brushing against her skin as the red and blue lights continued their slow, pulsing rhythm across her face, across the road, across everything. Brooks noticed it too, the shift in presence, the addition of another figure to the scene, and his attention split for a moment, just enough to create a space where control no longer felt absolute. He glanced over his shoulder, the beam of his flashlight lowering slightly as his focus moved, and the silhouette approaching from the second car became clearer. A man in a dark coat, posture upright, movements calm, not hurried, not uncertain, just purposeful, and that calm carried something with it, something that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Evelyn turned her head slightly now, her eyes following the figure as it came closer, but her expression did not change. There was no surprise there, no alarm, only a quiet awareness, as if she had been expecting the moment to shift. As if she understood that situations like this rarely remained contained for long. Brooks straightened again, instinctively, his stance adjusting, his grip on the license tightening just a fraction, and for a brief second the authority he carried felt less like a shield and more like something being observed, evaluated. The approaching man stopped a few feet away, not too close, not too distant, placing himself just outside the direct line of the flashing lights, his face partially illuminated, partially shadowed, and the balance of that light made it difficult to read him fully, but not impossible. His gaze moved from Brooks to Evelyn and then back again, not lingering, not judging, simply taking in the moment as it existed, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, layered with everything that had already been said and everything that had not yet found words. Evelyn drew in a slow breath, the air cool and steady, grounding, her eyes lifting once more toward Brooks, not seeking permission, not offering resistance, just present, the same quiet strength that had held from the beginning still there, unshaken. Brooks cleared his throat softly, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been. And for the first time since the stop began he hesitated, not in action but in certainty, the script he had relied on no longer fitting as cleanly as it once had, and that hesitation settled into the space between all three of them, subtle but undeniable. The lights continued to flash, but now they felt less like control and more like exposure, revealing rather than commanding, and the night, which had started as a simple stretch of road under artificial light, now felt like something else entirely, something unfolding, something waiting. And Evelyn stood there, steady, her presence unchanged, as if the moment itself had to adjust around her rather than the other way around. The man did not raise his voice when he finally spoke, and that alone shifted something in the air, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, the kind of clarity that did not compete with authority but quietly redefined it. "Officer," he said, his tone even, controlled, carrying a weight that came not from volume but from certainty. Brooks turned fully now, his posture straightening instinctively, his hand still holding Evelyn's license but no longer the center of the moment. "Is there an issue here?" the man continued, stepping just slightly closer into the wash of red and blue light, and as he did, his face became fully visible, composed, observant, the kind of presence that did not need introduction to be understood. Brooks blinked once, a small, almost imperceptible reaction, his eyes moving from the man to Evelyn and back again, recalculating, reassessing, something in his expression tightening, not defensively, but uncertainly. "Routine stop," Brooks replied, though the words no longer carried the same weight they had minutes ago. They sounded thinner now, like something being repeated rather than believed. The man's gaze shifted to Evelyn, softening just slightly, not with familiarity but with recognition, and he gave a small nod. Respectful, measured, before returning his attention to Brooks. "May I see the reason for the stop?" he asked, and it was not phrased as a demand, not framed as a challenge, but it did not leave much room for dismissal either. Brooks hesitated, just a fraction, but enough for the moment to register, enough for the balance to tilt ever so slightly. He glanced down at the license in his hand, then back up, and something in his shoulders lowered, not in surrender but in adjustment, driving below the speed limit, he said again, though this time the explanation felt exposed, as if placed under a light that asked more of it than it could provide. The man nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, then looked once more at Evelyn, who remained exactly as she had been, calm, steady, her presence unchanged by the shifting dynamics around her. "Ma'am," the man said gently, "are you all right?" Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes clear, her voice quiet but firm. "I am," she replied, and that was all. No embellishment, no complaint, just truth stated simply. The man held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to Brooks, and there was a pause, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something waiting to surface. Brooks felt it, the weight of it, the way the moment had moved beyond his initial control into something more complex, something layered with context he had not accounted for. He cleared his throat again, softer this time, and extended the license back toward Evelyn, the motion slower, more deliberate than before. "Here you go, Miss Carter," he said, and for the first time her name sounded different in his voice, less like a label, more like an acknowledgement. Evelyn accepted it with the same steady hand she had shown from the beginning, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the card, and in that brief contact the moment shifted again. Subtly but undeniably, as if something had been recognized without needing to be declared, the lights continued their quiet rhythm, but now they seemed less like a signal of control and more like a backdrop to something else entirely, something unfolding not in force, but in realization. The space between them settled into something quieter now, not empty but resolved in a way that did not need to announce itself, and Brooks felt it before he understood it, the shift from control to awareness, from assumption to something closer to truth. His hand lowering slowly after returning the license, fingers flexing once as if releasing more than just the plastic card. The red and blue lights still moved across the road, but they no longer dictated the moment. They only illuminated it. Revealing what had already changed, Evelyn held the license gently, not checking it, not rushing to put it away, just holding it for a second as if acknowledging the exchange for what it had been. Then she slipped it back into her wallet with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, her movements steady, unhurried, untouched by the tension that had filled the air moments before. The man who had stepped out of the second vehicle remained where he was, not intervening further. Not speaking again, his presence now less about action and more about witness, and that quiet witness seemed to carry its own kind of weight. Brooks cleared his throat once more, softer now, the sound almost lost in the open air, and when he spoke his voice was different, not entirely changed, but shifted, as if something inside it had been recalibrated. "You are free to go, ma'am," he said, and this time the word carried respect, not as a formality but as recognition. Evelyn looked at him for a brief moment, her eyes steady, not searching, not judging, simply seeing, and in that look there was no anger, no need to correct, no desire to hold the moment longer than it needed to be held, just a quiet understanding that did not require explanation. She gave a small nod, not as acceptance of permission but as closure, then turned toward her car, her steps measured, her posture unchanged. The cool night air moving gently around her as she reached for the door handle. The interior light flickered on again as she opened it, casting that same warm glow against the colder tones outside. She paused just for a second before getting in, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the door, and without turning back she spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying through the space without force. "Respect should not depend on who you think I am." The words were simple, but they did not fall away, they stayed, settling into the silence like something meant to remain. Brooks did not respond, not because he could not, but because there was nothing immediate that would not diminish what had already been said. His gaze followed her as she sat back inside the car, the door closing with a soft, final sound, and for a moment everything seemed still again, the kind of stillness that comes after something has shifted beneath the surface. The engine of her car started quietly, the headlights illuminating the road ahead in a clean, steady beam, and as she pulled away, slow and controlled, the red and blue lights reflected across her rear window one last time before fading into the distance, leaving behind only the quiet stretch of road and the echo of a moment that could not be undone. Brooks stood there, unmoving, the weight of the encounter settling into him not as a reprimand, but as something deeper, something that would stay long after the lights were turned off, while the man behind him remained silent, watching, not needing to say anything more for the truth of the moment to be fully seen. The road returned to silence in layers, first the fading hum of Evelyn's engine as her car disappeared into the distance, then the soft click of cooling metal from the patrol vehicle, and finally the absence of movement itself, a stillness that felt fuller than before, as if something had been left behind in the air, something that could not be seen but could be felt. Brooks stood where he was, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught somewhere in between, his hands lowering slowly to his sides as the red and blue lights continued their rhythm behind him, though now they seemed out of place, like echoes of a moment that had already passed. He watched the empty stretch of road for a second longer than necessary, as if expecting something to return, some explanation, some justification, but nothing came, only the quiet, steady night stretching forward without interruption. Behind him the man from the second vehicle remained still, his presence unchanged, not pressing, not leaving, simply there, and after a moment Brooks turned slightly, not fully facing him but acknowledging him, the movement subtle, restrained. "Thank you," Brooks said, the words coming out lower than before, not as authority, not as routine, but as something closer to humility. The man gave a small nod in response, not affirming, not dismissing, just recognizing, and that recognition carried its own weight. Brooks exhaled slowly, his breath visible for just a second in the cool air, then gone. He reached up and turned off the flashing lights, and as the red and blue faded the road changed again, returning to its natural darkness, illuminated only by the steady white beam of the streetlight further down, a softer light. One that did not command attention but offered clarity. Brooks glanced down at his hands, flexing them slightly as if testing something unseen, then looked back toward the road, his eyes tracing the path where Evelyn had driven away, and for a moment the memory of her voice settled in, not loud, not repeating, just present. Respect should not depend on who you think I am. The words did not accuse, they did not demand, they simply remained, and that made them harder to dismiss, harder to ignore. Brooks shifted his weight once more, but this time the movement felt different, less about control and more about grounding, as if he were standing in a place that required him to see more than he had before. The man behind him turned quietly, walking back toward his vehicle without another word, his footsteps steady, unhurried, and when the car door closed and the engine started, it did not disrupt the moment, it simply continued it. Another layer of motion in a night that had already changed. Brooks stood alone now, the space around him open. Unguarded, the badge on his chest catching a faint glint of light as he moved, and for the first time since the stop began, he did not reach for his radio, did not check his watch, did not move to the next task. He just stood there, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of something that could not be written into a report, something that would not fit into procedure, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded once, not to anyone, not to the road, but to the moment itself, as if acknowledging that it had changed him in a way he did not yet fully understand. Then he turned, walked back to his patrol car, and drove off into the night, the road stretching ahead, the silence following, and somewhere far beyond the reach of the fading headlights, a truth remained, steady and unspoken, waiting to be carried forward.